Everybody, thanks for coming this morning. My name's Adrian Dooley, and I'm going to talk about breaking down the barriers to implementing good practice. Now, I'm guessing we all have something in common, and that's the fact that we're here because we would like our projects to be more successful. Otherwise, why are we here talking about this? I'm going to talk about, hopefully, how we can actually do that. But I'm, first of all, going to give you a couple of things to think about while I'm talking about breaking down those barriers, and then I'm going to come back to them at the end of the presentation. So first of all, here are two lists of reasons why projects fail. Now actually these are symptoms of failure, they're not the reasons they fail, but that's another story. Now it will not have escaped your eagle eye that they're exactly the same. And I admit to a little bit of poetic license here, in that I've taken two surveys of why projects fail and played with them so they say exactly the same thing, without losing the content of the original surveys. Now, what I want you to think about for the next half hour is what is the underlying difference between these two lists, because there is a very significant difference. Right? So the point I'm making is two surveys come up with the same results based on very different inputs. So just give that some thought while I'm talking. The next one is I'm going to do a poll, but I wanted to pick up on a bit of background to this poll, first of all. I was doing a presentation for a conference at the NHS earlier in the year. And looking at stories from previous conferences, I happened to pick up on this statement from somebody who said, essentially, they'd been on a training course, they'd learned loads of good stuff, they'd gone back into the workplace, but they found it really difficult to implement the knowledge that they'd gained. And I suspect a lot of people have the same experience. So I've run a survey a couple of times, and I've essentially said to people, you go on a course, you learn a lot of really good stuff, and then you go back to the workplace and it doesn't necessarily get implemented. Do you find it very difficult to implement what you've learnt in the workplace for a whole range of reasons, or do you find it very simple? Do you get a lot of benefit from the training because you actually put those things into practice in the workplace? Now, I'll come back to this. I'll give you some results of other surveys. I'm not going to ask you to do these four options. I think what we'll do is we'll group the first two, that it's difficult or partially difficult to apply what you learn on courses in the workplace, or it's relatively easy and you do get real benefit. The organisation gets real benefit from it. But I'll come back to that and we'll have a quick show of hands on either the first two or the last two. So, into the meat of what I want to talk about. This is something called Cobb's paradox. Martin Cobb was Chief Information Officer at the Bureau of Treasury Board in Canada. And he made this statement. Now, it's controversial, I know. Do we really know why projects fail? Do we really know how to stop that happening? But it's a good starting point for a conversation. Maybe we just know a lot of stuff about why they fail, and we have a lot of knowledge about how to stop those things happening. But this is a point, it's a problem, actually applying what we learn. And although that's 27 years ago, do we think that is still a problem? Well, having consulted in various large organisations for many years, I was struck by a particular aspect of the lessons learned that these organisations captured. And I was fortunate enough to get hold of a database made available under the Freedom of Information Act from government, central government, local government, non-governmental organisations, and go through a large number of lessons learned. So, what do people think might have made their projects run better? Well, perhaps we should have identified a reason for the project. Well, there's an insight for you. Insight number two, because it changes depending on who you speak to. Well, there's a surprise. We should have involved business stakeholders from the start. Having a formal business case would have been beneficial. So, by now you're thinking, oh, if only I'd known those things before, my projects would have run so much better. One of the things you notice by going through lessons learned, and I don't know if any of you have this experience in your organisation, is that the reasons people give for projects failing, or the things they identify that could have been done better, are the kind of stuff that we teach on the first day of the most basic project management course. So the problem is not that there's stuff that we didn't know, the problem is there's stuff we know, but we don't do it. When I'm doing this presentation in a different way, I talk about the parallel with losing weight, something with which I'm very familiar. I think it's in the United States, the amount of money spent on fad diets is greater than the gross national product of Finland. And it doesn't work. Ultimately, if you want to lose weight, you need to eat less and move more. We all know that. It's not rocket science. The problem is not knowing that. The problem is actually doing it, implementing it. So, what are the barriers that stop us doing that? Well, what I and some colleagues have done is to say, let's try and find out the things that stop you implementing good practice, stop you implementing the things that we know we should really be doing. And we've produced this website, it's called the Praxis Framework, and it tries to address Cobb's paradox by making that knowledge more accessible and more easily implemented. And the barriers I'm going to talk about quite briefly. I could probably spend a whole session on each of these, but I'm going to whip through them quite quickly. I want to talk about the integration and accessibility of the content of good practice, and I'm going to talk about 4 areas that are to do with actually embedding that good practice in the workplace. So let's start with integration. Now, there's a few book covers here that many of you will be familiar with. We've got the PMI's PMBOK Guide, the APM's Body of Knowledge, Managing Successful Projects, Prince 2, and MSP from Axelos. Down in the bottom left-hand corner there, we have the APM's Competency Framework, the IPMA, International Project Management Association's Competency Baseline. And on the right-hand side, we have the maturity models, P3M3 from Axelos and the OPM3 from the PMI. These are just a tiny subset of all the good practice which is out there. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of guides, standards, frameworks, methodologies that accumulate the experience of many thousands of contributors. Now, these fall into 4 broad areas. Knowledge, that's the functions that make up the discipline of project and program management. So risk management, stakeholder management, planning, control, financial management, change management, all that kind of stuff. These are the functions that make up the discipline of project management. Method, that gives you a governance structure, a flow through the project, and explains when and how to apply all those different functions. Competence, obviously, these things aren't going to work unless the people who apply them are competent in their application. And capability maturity is a concept that says we can assess how well these ideas are embedded in your organization and rate the organization based on a very well tried and tested model. Now, the problem with all these guides is that they tend to fit into one of these quadrants. Sometimes they actually overlap one of the borders, but broadly speaking, any book you pick up which talks about project and program management, good practice, will fit into one of these quadrants. And they all use different terminology, different taxonomy, just different approaches, different packaging for the same good principles. So, what we've done is to say, right, let's first of all make all this free. You know, it's probably going to cost you about £300-400 to buy, probably more than that, to buy those guides that I'd listed there. So one of the first things we do is make it free, put it on the website, and we have all those topics from the knowledge, the functions that make up the discipline, Oops, sorry, pressing the wrong button. We then have the method, a series of life cycle-based processes that explain how to implement those procedures. We have what does a competent person look like when applying these, and what does a mature organisation look like when applying these. All using the same taxonomy, the same terminology, all interlinked with each other, tabs across the top so you can move between them, and just to emphasise the point, all completely free. And of course, when you go through any of these guides, you'll find they will make reference to all sorts of tools, techniques, and models which you should be using to implement them. So stakeholder management as a topic might talk about a stakeholder matrix. Scheduling will obviously talk about things like critical path analysis or Gantt charts. Finance will talk about internal rate of return or discounted cash flow, a whole range of tools and techniques, some of which are going to be relevant to you, a lot that aren't. But we also need some sort of encyclopedia which explains all those are, so that in the same spot you can move quickly from any one aspect of managing your project to another. So this is integration, and it works for projects and programs and portfolios, all within the same website. So it's accessible. But there are lots of other things we can do to make this accessible. One thing we do, for example, is to say there is an awful lot of good practice there. You're only going to use a subset of it. So let's create a front end. But that front end needs to access not only our generic good practice, but all the good stuff that's in your organisation. The experience that you've accumulated, the templates that you want to use, the stuff which is very specific to your industry or your company. So let's have a editable, a configurable front end, which you can then use to provide a tip of the iceberg for Praxis, integrated with the stuff that's on your intranet. And of course, make it a free download. And also make it relevant to different domains and different industries and different groupings. Anybody here from UK government departments? No? One? Either you're greatly underrepresented or you don't want to admit it. So let's assume there are a number of people that work in central government or local government. When I get a lot of people from government, I ask them, are you aware of the government standard, GovS2? And they generally say, no. Well, there is a government standard. And the reason I bring it up is simply because what we find is that when people produce a new overarching standard, we can map it very easily to all the good practice which is in the Praxis framework. So that makes it relevant to different circumstances, different domains, different contexts. And this is all about making it accessible and relevant. So all the content is there. You have this massive toolkit. And it's much more accessible than it was before, but that doesn't solve the problem in and of itself. So let's start off with the more behavioral problems that stop you from taking that wealth of good practice and doing something useful with it. Now, I'm sure many of you have been there. You start out full of enthusiasm on a Monday morning. You've got a great trainer. You're doing a great course. You start to get a bit nervous by Wednesday because there are some exams on the horizon. You swat like mad in the evenings. Friday, you maybe take an exam. Hopefully, you pass it. And then you go home, Friday night, gin and tonic, and relax. Monday morning, back in there, emails, phone calls, people knocking on the door, wanting to talk to you. What happens to all that good stuff you've learnt the week before? You're back into the hectic running of projects, and basically what happens is you carry on doing stuff the way you always did it before, because you don't get a chance to stop, take breath, and think about how can I apply that to my way of working. So there is this disconnect between gaining the knowledge and applying it. So one of the things that you will find in the framework is a series of checklists. So every topic within the knowledge and the method sections have a checklist. Now, at this point, I know a number of you are just dying a little bit on the inside because you're thinking, oh no, checklists. Project management by tick boxes. You say, nothing could be worse. Well, let's just look into this a little bit more. This idea is based on a book called The Checklist Manifesto. Anybody read The Checklist Manifesto? No? Good. I would recommend it. It's not a long book, and as business books go, it is actually a bit of a page turner, because the guy who wrote it is a surgeon, and some of the stories of surgeries that he performed are, as I say, quite engaging and gripping. So this was an American surgeon who was contacted by the World Health Organization and said, we have a problem. There are too many fatalities from surgery around the world, too many bad outcomes. How can we improve the success rate of surgery? So he went out and he looked at other industries, construction, airlines, and so on, and he came up with the idea of checklists. Now, we all have this stereotypical surgeon-type person probably in our heads. They rule their roost. They're not going to fill in checklists, are they? They're going to resist anything like that because they're the surgeons, they're the magicians who solve the problems you have. So he had a real uphill struggle to get people to accept this. But the result was that surgical outcomes, surgical deaths, were reduced by 40% because of these checklists. Before, if like me, you find yourself on the operating table, it's very reassuring to know that before the surgeon is allowed to cut the skin, he has to check on the checklist whether he's got the right leg. I mean, the correct leg. So, has he got the right leg? Are there any allergies? Does everybody in the room know each other's name? Now, all of these may seem a little inane, but next time you get on an aeroplane, think about the inane checklist that the pilots are going through before they take off. And if they weren't going to, no, we know it all. It's not a problem. No, we'll make it up as we go along. Don't worry. Let's just take off anyway. I, for one, would be off that plane very quickly. Now, these medical checklists are now standard practice in the NHS. And worldwide, they have resulted in 40% reduction in post-surgical death, which, for me, is pretty impressive. And if they can benefit from it when it's a case of life and death, I'm sure we, as humble project managers, can learn something from it. One of the interesting things at the end of this book is that he surveyed all the surgeons who were involved in this and said, so, come on, tell me, do you think it was a good idea? Did you like it? 20% said, no, I'm not that keen. I don't think it really makes that much difference. But he then very cleverly asked them a different question. If you were on the operating table, would you like to think that the team had been through this checklist? 93% said yeah. So I don't believe it, but I actually want it if I'm the one on the operating table. Now then, let's just go back to these lessons learned. If we were encouraged to go through these checklists of good practice, would we still get lessons learned that said, if we planned communications and kept staff fully involved through the project, then things would have gone a bit better? If we'd involved the stakeholders, if we'd had a formal business case, the project would have gone better. And if we'd gone through filling in these checklists, just to make sure we'd done those things, just to remind us about the good stuff we learnt last week, I suggest that could make a real difference, just as it has done worldwide in surgery. And now I'm going to move on quite quickly because I've only got a relatively short period of time, but I will come back to that in a moment. This is something called Bloom's taxonomy. I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but it's basically a hierarchy that takes you from basic knowledge through to high levels of competence. And let's just think about where, if my clicker will work, there we go, where typical courses and certifications lie. If you see somebody saying, I've just gained a Prince Foundation, or a PMI CAPM, or an APM PFQ, what that means is that person can recall knowledge. Doesn't tell you they can do anything with it, it tells you they can recall knowledge. They know the language, they know how it all fits together, but that's about it. Practitioner level certifications, those say that you actually understand the knowledge. Given an artificial scenario, you can choose the right approach. So that practitioner level is about understanding, summarizing, demonstrating. And at the top, the ability to synthesize and evaluate that information for different contexts. That's where we want people at the peak of the profession to be. And the APM have the Chartered Project Professional, which is really the peak of the profession. But as you can see, in between is a yawning gap. Analysis and application. How do we get people to go from just gaining the knowledge by Friday evening and then not being able to apply it on Monday morning? Where that big question mark is, that's solving that conundrum of application and analysis starts on the Monday morning. So within, one of the things we found when we created Praxis and put it out there, just for people to do whatever they wanted with, was lots of people started coming along and saying, well, first thing they said, well, if it's free, it can't be any good. But lots of things in life actually are free. Wikipedia, the World Wide Web, and a lot of the technology that drives it is all made free by its inventors, and we happily use it. Praxis is free, and to date, 8 different teams have come along and said, can we translate that into our language, please? And these volunteer teams have translated it into Italian, French, Spanish, Chinese, Indonesian. There's one team well advanced on German, and interestingly, just started on Urdu. So if you put something out there in this way, people come to you. And APM Group came along and said, well, we could do a series of certifications on this. So we said, okay. And we have the classic foundation. People recall the knowledge. We have the practitioner. People know in principle how to apply it. Then we have the professional, which says, I've been there, I've done it, I've got the T-shirt and the scars. Can you please verify that I've got the T-shirt and scars? Talk to people who can verify that on my behalf and give me the professional. And then it's a very short hop, skip and a jump to chartered status. But again, there's this massive gap in the middle between gaining the knowledge and actually doing something useful with it. Now, we try to fill that gap with, for example, making the knowledge accessible and usable. So I mentioned Praxis Local makes it relevant to your particular circumstances. The checklists just give you that structure, that motivation, that little bit of help to apply and make sure you've applied it correctly. And I will keep coming back to this. And then the third one we've got down there is another concept I want to introduce at this stage. All those different guides and standards and frameworks that I talked about, they all assume we're all the same. So they talk about stakeholder management, risk management, organization management, and they give us this information and this good practice, and assume that we will all interpret it the same way. Because we as a team, and I mean the broader team, not just the people doing the work, but also the stakeholders, the sponsor, and so on, we need to be able to understand this stuff collectively. So, another example of, you put the stuff up there, people will come along and say, we'd like to help. So we were approached by some people who said, look, we think good practice needs to be adapted to different personalities. And again, to cut a long story short, I'll just say that there is a personality profiling tool called DISC. The DISC comes from dominant, influential, steady, and conscientious. It's based on a system that was developed in the 20s and 30s. And even though tools that do these kind of analyses generally are not called DISC, DISC is the underlying theory behind it. So that one of our principles was, well, if we're going to work with this, it needs to be available to people for free. So we don't want paywalls unless we absolutely have to, or people get real value from it. So you can actually go online and do a DISC analysis for free. You can then take the result of that analysis and look at a whole range of pages that say, in terms of stakeholder management, if you are predominantly red, a dominant personality, you want action taken quickly. Let's get on with it, let's get it sorted, let's not mess about. But if that might be the sponsor, for example, but the project manager might be a more conscientious, have a more conscientious leaning, who says, well, I need a clear understanding of what stakeholder management is aiming to achieve. So the project manager, quite reasonably, based on their way of understanding the information, says, hang on, I need clear objectives, I want to understand what we're trying to achieve. The sponsor, who's a red, saying, oh, just get on with it. You know, forget the checklists, forget all the good stuff, just do it. And there might be people on the team who are influential, who are saying, yeah, what I'm really interested in is the interaction with the stakeholders. You know, I'm not necessarily that big into the process or the objectives. I just want to talk to people and hug them all and bring them on side to our project. Meanwhile, the steady behaviour person is saying, yeah, well, I want to make sure that everybody is properly involved, goes through the right process. None of these natural attitudes are wrong. They're different. There's no right or wrong, and we need elements of all of them. But what we're trying to do here is to say all the members of the team are going to perceive this good practice in different ways. So let's understand how the way we internalize that good practice compared to the way other people internalize the good practice. So I need to know what's different between me and everybody else so that we can communicate better. And if the whole team understands each other, so much the better. Oh, look, it's the checklists again. So I've dealt with making the stuff accessible, with trying to help get it implemented, with making sure that even though we have a diverse team, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet because we understand how each other looks at these things in different ways. How do we know this is benefiting the organisation? Well, the idea of having checklists, I've tried to convince you is a good idea because surgeons use them, airline pilots use them, so why don't project managers use them? If we construct those checklists in a way that matches an organisational capability maturity model, then when you fill in those checklists just for yourself to make sure you're applying the good practice, as a result, you can get a report that says, well, if you've done all those things, then for stakeholder management or organisation management or risk management, you're at level 1 organisational maturity on your project or programme. And actually, you've achieved 3 or 4 of the attributes of level 2. These are the outstanding things you need to do in order to reach level 2. So you have a real-time dashboard of how organisational application of project management is improving from Monday morning after the course, metaphorically speaking. But of course, I'm the project manager, been on the course, arrive full of enthusiasm on Monday morning, start flinging my checklists. Stakeholder management. I'm a stakeholder management ninja. I know stakeholder management inside out. My stakeholders love me. I communicate with them so well. Everybody I know is just on my team is just as good at stakeholder management. Well, these checklists are 360 degree. So let's invite the stakeholders to fill them in. And the stakeholders fill them in. No, I'm not feeling the love. You're not as good at stakeholder management as you think you are. It's important to get a rounded view of these things. So these checklists are not just for the project manager. They're for the sponsor, the stakeholders, the team members, to get a rounded view of how well your project is performing against certain standards of best practice. I fell into the trap of calling it best practice. There's no such thing as best practice except in a very tight context. It's good practice from which we select a subset which is the best for our context. And what we can do is to say, as an organisation, right, we get the broader team on each project to comment on how well they think it's running. Now, not only does that act as a reality check, perhaps, for the project manager, it also brings the stakeholders and the team into the process of thinking about the project in the right way. How many times do projects fail because of a disconnect between the team and the stakeholders? This brings them together. This brings them to a point where they can discuss their differences. Because maybe I've got a report that says, well, you think you're at level 2, but the stakeholders think you're at level 1. These are the things you disagree on. How do you resolve those differences? Is it just because the stakeholders don't understand the process, or is it because the team are predominantly blues and the stakeholders are predominantly yellows? I don't know, but at least you're going to sit down and talk about it and try to get an overall view of how the project is going. And then you can consolidate this so that you cover all the projects within a program and you get a view of how well the program's being run. And you can consolidate all the projects and programs into a portfolio and find out how the portfolio is being run. So in effect, what you get, perhaps this is something for the PMO people amongst you, what you get is a real-time dashboard of how the projects are progressing and how they're improving as you start to apply the good practice in a systematic way. And I don't know if any, with the full expectation of no hands at all, has anybody here ever been involved in a maturity assessment in their organisation? Whoa, quite a few. That's good. How did that experience go? Did you enjoy it? Hands up if you enjoyed it, found it useful. Yeah, we've got one. Yeah, okay. But how that normally goes is that you get some people come in and they interview a selection of project managers and program managers, and the result is usually you're not very good at running programs. You're at level 0 or level 1, so you're not very good at this. But what we're going to do is to collect all these results, and then we're going to develop a program to improve your maturity. And I say that recognizing the irony of, I've just told you you're no good at running programs, and now I'm going to give you a program to run to make running programs better. There's a fundamental flaw there. And then 6 months, a year later, they come and do the same process all over again and tell you you've got from 1 to 3. Great. Well, I think there's a much better way of approaching this. It's Monday morning again. You send people all on the course. You don't want to do this big set-piece assessment to find out if it's worked. Chances are it hasn't. and then do another one 6 months later. Let's start making things better on Monday morning. So the individuals and then the wider teams start filling in the checklist, start understanding how they're all internalising this good practice information in different ways, and then start to incrementally improve. So it's not just about we're only interested if you're at 1 or 2 or 3. We're interested in all the baby steps you're taking to get from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And as I explained before, you get these reports to say, you've reached level 1 because you've done this, 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 and this. You've achieved this, this, and this from level 2. You just need to fill in a couple of blanks here and here in order to be completely at level 2. And it may be you've already done some of the things at level 3. So it just gives you this ability on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis to incrementally improve and not get stressed out by some major assessment. And you have a real-time dashboard, and your organisational maturity is almost a byproduct of helping individuals with their jobs. So, let's come back to the original question I posed. Has anybody got any suggestions as to what the difference between these two surveys might be? The fundamental difference, underlying difference. I'm seeing a lot of very blank faces. Nobody wants to make a suggestion. I'll tell you the sort of things I sometimes get. People, different audiences. Could be. It could be that I'm comparing construction with IT and saying, well, it's the same problems regardless of domain. I could be saying it's the PMI approach versus the Prince approach, saying, well, it doesn't make any difference regardless of what approach you use. But the difference is, the first survey was done in 1972, and I picked it up from the proceedings of one of the very early International Project Management Association conferences. The one on the right was published on LinkedIn about 3-4 weeks ago. So obviously the point I'm making is nothing much has changed in 50 years. So Cobb's paradox might have been 27 years ago. The first one of these ever conferences that I spoke at might have been 31 years ago, but this goes back to 50 years ago, and not much changes. That's not because we don't have the knowledge, the good practice. It's because we're having real problems in actually applying it. I'm sure a lot of you recognise Douglas Adams, author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, who came up with numerous interesting quotes. One of my favourites: human beings who are almost unique in having the ability to learn from the experience of others are also remarkable for their apparent disinclination to do so. So it comes down to the, I know how to lose weight. I just need to eat less and move more. Knowledge isn't the problem. It's the incentive and the discipline to actually do it which is the problem. So I don't need to spend a fortune on fad diets and the latest silver bullets. I just need to get it into my thick skull. Then I need to keep going for that post-lunchtime walk and avoid the slice of cake just before I go to bed. Now, if any of you have been on training courses, so we're just going to do 2 here, quick show of hands. Did you, on the whole, find it hard to apply what you'd learnt back in the workplace following the course? Does anybody want to admit that? Yeah, quite a few. Anybody found it really easy to apply? No. Tentative, maybe. All right. I think it's a fairly clear majority in favour of it was hard. So I've done this survey a few times. It demonstrates that Pareto is alive and well because we have an 80-20 split. 80 on the whole found it difficult to apply good knowledge in the workplace, and 20% found it on the whole quite easy. So my view is that problem of applying good practice really is there. And what I hope I've demonstrated is that we don't have the complete answer, but we have quite a few approaches that will help. So instead of having multiple different guides that you have to somehow bend to each other, trim them, adapt them to fit together, what we've done is to produce a completely integrated framework. We've made it accessible. We've shown how it can be made relevant to your domain, your circumstances. And then we address a lot of the social, mental issues with actually making it work. So, the Monday morning. Yeah, I've been on the course, got the knowledge. From first thing Monday morning, I need to get into the mindset of actually applying it. I know people are knocking on my door, there's emails to deal with, the phone keeps ringing, but I've got to make the time to go for that post-lunch walk, to use up a few calories. I've got to make the time to just go through this checklist. And it's just 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, just to get those good habits embedded in the way you and your team run the projects. We need to think about our long-term personal development. We need to stop thinking, oh, I've got a foundation certificate, so that's it. I've done it. I know everything there is to know. No, this is a long process, going from your first project and understanding language through to being at the peak of the profession. We need to understand different people, interpret and internalize all that good practice in different ways. And we need to recognize, I need to recognize the way you're going to interpret that good practice and vice versa. And as a team, we need to have a common understanding. And while we're doing all this, why don't we just demonstrate the benefits to our organization by seeing the incremental improvement in the organization's maturity? It's all actually quite straightforward. There is no rocket science. There are no silver bullets. This is about a few minutes here and there of discipline to just stop, think, am I doing the right thing? Have I done the right thing? Can I do something a bit better? And I think that that is the solution to Cobb's paradox. We do know a lot of stuff. Projects do fail, and we can apply that good stuff to stop a lot of them failing. So this is what we have, something called the Praxis Pathway, which basically summarizes everything I've just been talking about. The important thing is that the path for the individual and the path for the team and the path for the organization are all intertwined. No one is separate from the others. Each contributes and helps and supports the others. All this is online and it's all free. But I do know that a lot of people, we like books, we like to be able to make notes in the margin, we like the tangible, we like to feel it, I've got the thing. And we're very lucky that the stationery office, TSO, well-known publishers of good practice, have said, and we'll make this also available to people as a printed book. So that's it, it's out there. I hope you find it, and I hope you find it useful. And thank you for your attention, thank you for your time. Thank you very much. You're all sitting there thinking, what on earth was all that? Thank you very much, it's very kind of you.